On the night of March 3, 1989, a killer walked into a roadside motel in Indiana, murdered the young woman working the front desk, and then got back in his car. He drove 50 miles south down Interstate 65, and at a second motel, he did it again. 2 women, 2 front desks, 1 night. They were doing the most ordinary thing in the world. Working the overnight shift, checking in the last guests, balancing the books at 2 in the morning in an empty lobby off the highway. It was a job thousands of people did every night without a second thought. Because what could possibly happen at a motel front desk in the middle of nowhere? The answer for these women was a man who had figured out that a night shift clerk alone at a roadside motel was the most vulnerable target in America. He had killed before. 2 years earlier, in Kentucky, he'd murdered a woman working the desk at another motel. And after that night of double murder in 1989, he would attack again. A 4th woman, left for dead, who somehow survived, and who was able to give police an excellent description of the man who did it. And then he disappeared. Not for a year, not for 10. For more than 3 decades, the police had his DNA. They had a survivor's description. They knew, by 2010, that they were hunting a single serial killer. And they could not put a name to him, because the man had never been caught for these crimes, and his DNA matched no one in any database. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly what we do here. Here is the part that should chill you. While the families of his victims spent 30 years not knowing, the man who killed them was not hiding in a hole. He was living an ordinary, and by all accounts admired life in a small town. A charismatic, generous man his neighbors loved, who sold vegetables at the farmer's market and was praised in his own obituary as someone whose spirit would live on through his good deeds. He died of cancer, comfortable and mourned, in 2013. He thought he had gotten away with it. He thought he had taken his secret to the grave. And 9 years after they buried him, his own family tree finally gave him up. This is the story of the I-65 killer, the women he hunted, the one who got away, and the science that named a serial killer who was already dead. Before the name, before the science, there was the pattern, and understanding the pattern is understanding how deliberate this killer was. He targeted a very specific victim, a woman working alone, overnight, at the front desk of a roadside motel along or near Interstate 65, the highway that runs up through Kentucky and Indiana toward Chicago. Think about why that target is so calculated. A night shift motel clerk is isolated by design. She's alone in a lobby for 8 hours. The building is full of strangers who come and go. There's cash in the register. And in the pre-dawn hours, there is often no one else awake for a long way in any direction. For a predator, it was a perfect hunting ground, repeated at motel after motel down a highway corridor. The attacks clustered in the colder months, roughly January through March, which led investigators to a theory that the killer might be a seasonal worker, someone whose job or travel brought him through the region at a particular time of year. They considered that he might be a long-haul truck driver or a traveling salesman, someone for whom being on the highway, checking in and out of motels, was completely unremarkable. A man who could appear at a front desk at 2 in the morning and raise no alarm at all because he looked exactly like every other tired traveler passing through. The crimes themselves followed a brutal, consistent script. He would rob the motel, the cash from the register. He would sexually assault the woman working the desk, and he would shoot her. This was not a robbery that spiraled out of control. The sexual assault and the murder were the point. The robbery was almost incidental. He was a rapist and a killer who used the robbery and the anonymity of the highway as cover. For years, investigators in different states were looking at pieces of the same monster without knowing it. A murder in Kentucky, murders in Indiana, an assault here, a robbery there. It would take forensic science to prove what the pattern suggested, that these scattered crimes, across state lines, across years, were the work of one man, and it would take far longer to give that man a name. Let's start with the first woman we know he killed. Her name was Vicki Lucille Heath. She was 41 years old, and on the night of February 21, 1987, she was working the front desk at the Super 8 Motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Elizabethtown sits just off Interstate 65 south of Louisville, the kind of highway town built around travelers passing through. Vicky was doing what she did, manning the desk overnight, keeping the small operation running while the town slept. She was a real person with a real life, 41 years old, with people who loved her and expected her to come home. She never did. Sometime that night, a man came into the lobby. What he left behind told part of the story of how hard Vicky fought. The motel lobby showed clear signs of a struggle. At one point during the attack, a telephone was ripped clean out of the wall. This was not someone who went quietly. This was a woman fighting for her life in the place where she worked. When it was over, her attacker had sexually assaulted her and shot her. And then, in a detail that speaks to how coldly practical he was, he moved her body. Police later found Vicky behind a trash dumpster in the motel parking lot, hidden from view, the way you'd hide something you wanted to buy time before anyone found. In 1987, the investigation into Vicky Heath's murder was a local Kentucky case. Investigators had a crime scene, they had evidence, and they had the killer's biological material, but they had no way, in that era, to connect it to anyone, and no reason yet to think this was anything other than a horrifying one-off. A traveler, a stranger, gone down the highway into the dark. They could not have known that what happened to Vicky Heath in that Elizabethtown parking lot was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The same man would be back on the highway 2 years later, and on a single night in 1989, he would take not one woman, but two. March 3, 1989, 2 years after Vicky Heath, the killer returned to Interstate 65, this time in Indiana, and what he did over the course of that one night is almost incomprehensible in its cold efficiency. The first was Margaret Mary Gill. Everyone knew her as Peggy. She was 24 years old, working as the overnight auditor at the Days Inn in Merrillville, Indiana. The overnight audit shift runs from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. The quiet hours, balancing the day's books. That night, the motel had around 70 rooms booked. Peggy was last accounted for at 1:30 in the morning when she checked in her final guest. An ordinary transaction. A key handed across a counter, and then she was alone again. Sometime after that, the killer came. When the motel manager arrived later that morning and couldn't find Peggy, a search of the property turned up something no one should ever have to find. Peggy Gill's body was at the end of a vacant hallway. She had been sexually assaulted and shot twice in the head. The cash drawer at the front desk had been forced open. The amount taken was $179. That is what her life was treated as worth by the man who took it. $179 from a register. But he wasn't finished that night. After killing Peggy Gill in Merrillville, the killer got back on Interstate 65 and drove roughly 52 miles south to the Days Inn in Remington, Indiana. And there, working the front desk, was Jean Gilbert. Jean was 34 years old, and here is the detail about her that breaks your heart wide open. Jean wasn't even supposed to be working that night. She was covering the shift as a favor, so that a co-worker could attend her own daughter's high school cheerleading competition. Jean Gilbert died because she said yes to a kindness. She traded shifts to let another mother watch her daughter cheer, and it cost Jean her life. Her body was found by a driver on the side of a road in White County, Indiana. She too had been raped and murdered. 2 women, 50 miles apart, on the same night, by the same hand. Jean Gilbert left behind children. Years later, her daughter Kim would remember the last words her mother ever said to her and her brother, that she loved them and that she would see them tomorrow. Kim would say simply, "I didn't see her that tomorrow, but I see her every day. I see her in me. I see her in my brother. I see her in my family." If the killer had a fatal mistake, and it would take decades to prove that it was fatal, it was that not every woman he attacked died. In early 1990, at a Days Inn in Columbus, Indiana, he struck again. He attacked a woman working there, sexually assaulted her, and left her for dead. But she did not die. She survived. And because she survived, she could do something none of his murdered victims could. She could describe him. Investigators would later say she provided an excellent physical description of both the suspect and the crime, a first-hand account from someone who had looked this man in the face and lived. In a case built almost entirely on forensic evidence left at scenes where the only witness had been murdered, a living, speaking survivor was extraordinary. She put a human description to the ghost on the highway. Now investigators had two things pulling in the same direction. They had the survivor's account of what the man looked like, and they had the physical evidence from the scenes. What they needed was to prove that all of these attacks, Kentucky, Indiana, 1987, 1989, 1990, were connected, that they weren't chasing several different criminals, but one. The forensic work came together over the following years. Ballistic evidence from the Peggy Gill and Jean Gilbert murders matched. The same weapon had been used in both, confirming what the single-night timeline already suggested. And the Indiana State Police Laboratory went further, using DNA analysis to link the murders of Vicky Heath and Jeannie Gilbert and the assault of the surviving victim in Columbus to one another. The science was now saying, in the language of certainty, what the pattern had whispered for years. In 2010, the Kentucky State Police made it official. DNA evidence had linked the murders. They announced that they were dealing with a serial killer. A single man had been hunting motel clerks along Interstate 65 for years. They had his DNA. They had a survivor's description. They had a profile, likely a seasonal worker, possibly a trucker or salesman. By their estimate, a man who would by then be somewhere between 55 and 65 years old. They had, in a sense, everything except the one thing that mattered, his name. And for that, the evidence they were holding was useless, because the man they were hunting was not in any criminal DNA database. To find him, they would have to wait for a science that did not yet exist. The wall this case hit is the same wall that runs through every cold case on this channel, and by now you know its shape. The traditional criminal DNA database, CODIS, only contains the profiles of people who have been arrested or convicted of qualifying crimes. Run a crime scene sample against it, and you only get a hit if your killer is already in the system. The I-65 killer was not in the system for these crimes, so for decades his complete genetic profile, recovered from multiple scenes, linking multiple murders, matched no one. The evidence was perfect and completely mute. Then came investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that had, in 2018, cracked the Golden State Killer case and set off a revolution in cold case work across the country. The method turns the entire problem inside out. Instead of searching criminal databases for the killer himself, you take his crime scene DNA and upload it to public genealogy databases, the ones where ordinary people submit their DNA to trace their ancestry. You're not looking for the killer, you're looking for his relatives. The search returns genetic matches, cousins, distant and not so distant, people who share DNA with the unknown killer. From those matches, genealogists build family trees, working through birth records, marriages, obituaries, and public records, narrowing the branches until they converge on the one person who fits every piece of the puzzle: the right age, the right sex, the right geography, present in the right places at the right times. In 2019, recognizing that this new technology might finally break the case open, the Indiana State Police brought in reinforcements. They requested the help of the FBI's Gang Response Investigative Team, and together they applied investigative genealogy to the I-65 evidence. They took the killer's DNA, the same profile that had been useless against CODIS for years, and ran it through the genealogical process. The DNA led them to a close family member of the killer, and from that relative, the family tree pointed to one man. When investigators tested the connection, the result was staggering in its certainty. A match of 99.9999%. There was no meaningful doubt. After more than 3 decades, the I-65 killer finally had a name. The name was Harry Edward Greenwell. And when investigators finally learned it, they also learned that they were nearly a decade too late to ever put him in a courtroom. Harry Greenwell had died of cancer in 2013, at the age of 68, in Iowa. He had been dead for 9 years by the time the DNA named him in 2022. There would be no arrest, no trial, no confrontation. The families who had waited more than 30 years for a name would receive that name, and, in the same breath, the knowledge that the man was already beyond the reach of any justice a court could deliver. But when they pulled his history, the picture that emerged confirmed exactly the kind of man the pattern had predicted, and revealed how he had slipped through the cracks for so long. Greenwell had an extensive criminal history, stretching from 1963 all the way to 1998. As a young man in Kentucky, he'd been arrested for armed robbery and later on a serious assault charge. He had been in and out of prison several times. He had even escaped from custody on 2 separate occasions. This was not a man with no record. This was a career criminal. So why wasn't he caught? Because his long criminal history predated the era of DNA databasing. The crimes that put him in and out of prison in the 60s, 70s, and 80s happened before authorities routinely collected DNA from offenders and entered it into a searchable national system. By the time CODIS became the powerful tool it is today, Greenwell had aged out of the system's reach. His violent history was in paper files, not in the genetic database that would have flagged him instantly. He had committed his motel murders in a narrow window, recent enough to leave recoverable DNA, but in an era where that DNA had nothing to be matched against. He fit the profile the investigators had built with eerie precision. He was known to travel frequently throughout the Midwest, and there was a detail from his life that resonates darkly with the case. At one point, Harry Greenwell worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway, retiring from that position in 2010. A man whose life and work kept him moving across the region. Exactly the kind of mobile, unremarkable traveler the investigators had theorized was slipping from motel to motel down the highway. He had hidden not by being a shadow, but by being a type. A middle-aged man passing through. And when he finally stopped killing, or at least stopped leaving the trail that connected to these cases, he settled into a life that made the truth almost impossible to believe. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, and the most important not to look away from. In the years after the murders, Harry Greenwell did not live like a hunted man. He lived in a small town, like a pillar of it. By the accounts that emerged after his identification, he was charismatic. He was generous. He was, to the people who knew him, a genuinely likable man. He had hobbies that painted a picture of a gentle, contented life. Organic gardening, selling his produce at the local farmers market, traveling, reading, and enthusiasm for college sports and horse racing. He was, in the words used to describe him, noted for his generosity, someone with many friends. When he died in 2013, his obituary read the way a good man's obituary reads. He was remembered as a man with many friends who loved his straight-up attitude and his willingness to help anyone. His spirit, it said, would live on in many through the good deeds he offered. Read that again, knowing what you now know. His spirit will live on through the good deeds he offered. This was written about a man who sexually assaulted and murdered women working alone at night to make a living, who killed 2 of them in a single night, who left a 4th for dead. The community that mourned him had no idea. They were grieving a version of Harry Greenwell that never really existed. The friendly farmer's market vendor, the generous neighbor, while the families of Vicky Heath and Peggy Gill and Jean Gilbert grieved daughters and mothers taken by a man whose name they didn't even know. There is a temptation, in true crime, to imagine that monsters look like monsters, that evil announces itself. Harry Greenwell is the refutation of that comforting idea. He is proof that a man can do the most monstrous things imaginable and then spend decades being loved, admired, and mourned, with the horror sealed inside him where no one could see it. He did not get away with it because he was a criminal mastermind. He got away with it because he understood that the safest disguise in the world is an ordinary, likable life. And he very nearly took it all the way to the end. He died believing, we can only assume, that he had won, that his secret was buried with him. He was wrong about one thing. The same blood that made him a beloved uncle, a friend, a neighbor, also tied him by invisible genetic threads to every relative who would ever spit into a tube out of simple curiosity about where their family came from. He could hide himself. He could not hide his bloodline. On April 5, 2022, the Indiana State Police, the FBI, and Kentucky authorities stood together at a news conference in Indianapolis and told the world what they had found. After more than 30 years, the I-65 killer, the Days Inn killer, had a name: Harry Edward Greenwell. Some of the victims' family members were in the room, and what was said there mattered, because for these families, this press conference was the closest thing to a verdict they would ever get. Indiana State Police Superintendent Douglas Carter spoke directly to the families in attendance. He told them he hoped the day might bring them a little solace, to know, as he put it, that the animal who did this is no longer on this earth. It was blunt, and it was meant to be. There would be no trial where a jury could pronounce Greenwell guilty. This was the substitute, a room full of law enforcement, saying out loud, at last, the name of the man responsible. And then Jean Gilbert's daughter, Kim Gilbert Wright, now an attorney, spoke. She thanked the many agencies that had kept these cases at the forefront for more than 33 years, that had worked tirelessly and never let them go cold in the way that matters. She spoke about healing and about how it would look different for every family touched by these crimes, that while the news might officially close the cases, new chapters of healing would now begin, written differently for each of them. And Kim Wright did something that reveals the extraordinary grace some victims' families summon in the face of the unimaginable. She offered her condolences to Greenwell's own family and friends. She said that in addition to the victims' families, she believed his family and friends had also become victims of his crimes. People who had loved a man they never truly knew, who would now have to carry the truth about him for the rest of their own lives. Think about what it takes to stand in that room, having lost your mother to this man 33 years earlier, and extend compassion to the people who loved him. That is the opposite of what he was. And in a strange way, it's the final word on the whole case. The killer offered the world a fake goodness, a performance of a kind man. The daughter of one of his victims offered the world a real one. The identification of Harry Greenwell is a landmark, and it's worth being clear about exactly what it proves, because the implications reach far beyond these 4 attacks. For most of the history of criminal justice, a killer who was never caught in his lifetime, and who died before the technology matured, was simply gone, a permanent question mark. The case might stay technically open, but everyone understood that a dead, unnamed killer meant a mystery that would never close. Greenwell shatters that assumption. It shows that death is no longer an escape. Investigative genealogy reached into the grave 9 years after Harry Greenwell was buried and pulled his name into the light. You can die. You cannot unleave your DNA, and you cannot sever yourself from the family tree that will outlive you. That matters enormously for the thousands of cold cases sitting in evidence rooms across the country, cases where the killer left DNA, was never in a database, and may well be dead. Before genealogy, those were hopeless. Now they are merely difficult. The same technique that named Greenwell is, right now, being pointed at case after case that everyone had written off, and it is producing names of the living to be arrested and of the dead to at least be known. There's also a specific lesson in how Greenwell slipped through for so long, and it's about the gap between a criminal history and a genetic one. Greenwell had a long, violent record. In an era of universal DNA databasing, a man like that would very likely have been flagged the moment his crime scene DNA was run. But his record was built in the decades before that system existed. He fell into a generational blind spot, too criminal to be innocent, too early to be in the database. Genealogy closed that blind spot from a different direction entirely. It didn't need Greenwell's DNA to be on file. It only needed a relative's. And the Indiana State Police made clear that the story may not be over. When they announced Greenwell's identification, they also stated they were investigating the distinct possibility that he was involved in other violent crimes across the Midwest. A man who traveled constantly, who killed at least 3 women and assaulted a 4th over a span of years, who was never caught. It would be naive to assume these 4 attacks were the complete list. The name has opened doors that had been sealed for decades. Other families, in other states, with their own unnamed losses, may yet get their answer too, because Harry Greenwell finally has a face. Strip away the science and the serial killer notoriety, and this case is, at its heart, about 3 women whose only mistake was going to work. Vicky Heath, 41, Peggy Gill, 24, Jean Gilbert, 34, and a fourth woman who survived and has lived with it ever since. They were night shift workers, the people who keep the lights on and the doors open while the rest of us sleep. There is a particular injustice in how the world tends to treat victims like these. They weren't famous. Their deaths at the time were regional news that faded. They were, in the cold arithmetic of attention, easy to forget. Women at motel desks off a highway, in towns most people have never heard of. But their families never forgot, and neither, crucially, did the investigators. One of the most important things said at that 2022 press conference came from the FBI. These cases did not go unsolved all those years because of a lack of effort. Investigators continuously tracked leads across the country and did everything they could. That's worth honoring. For 33 years, detectives who could have let these fade instead kept them alive, kept the evidence preserved, kept the files active, so that when the science finally arrived, there was something for it to work with. A cold case only gets solved if someone refuses to let it die in the meantime. And there's Jean Gilbert's shift, the one she took as a favor. It's the detail I can't stop thinking about, and I don't think you will either. She died because she was kind, because she traded a shift so another mother could watch her daughter cheer. The randomness and unfairness of that is almost unbearable, and it's exactly why these stories have to be told carefully, not as entertainment about a clever killer, but as a record of who these women actually were. Jean was a mother who did a good turn for a coworker. That's not a footnote to the story of Harry Greenwell. That's the story. He is the footnote to hers. The killer performed goodness his whole life and fooled a town. The people who actually embodied it were the women he killed, and the daughter who stood up 33 years later and offered compassion even to his family. Harry Greenwell got a beautiful obituary he did not deserve. Vicky, Peggy, and Jean deserve to be remembered as who they truly were. That's the correction this episode exists to make. If there's a lesson in the I-65 killer case, it's that you can outrun the police, outrun a description, even outrun your own death, but you cannot outrun your family tree. Harry Greenwell did almost everything right, from a killer's perspective. He chose isolated victims. He worked a highway corridor where a stranger raised no alarm. He committed his crimes in the narrow window before DNA databasing could catch a man with his record. He stopped, or covered his tracks well enough that the trail went cold, and then he vanished into an ordinary, admired life and died peacefully, mourned as a good man, certain he'd taken his secret to the grave. He was undone by something he could never have anticipated and could not have prevented. A distant relative's curiosity about their ancestry, uploaded to a database, connecting through invisible threads of shared blood to the DNA he left at a motel front desk in 1989. The science didn't need to catch him. It didn't need him alive. It only needed his family. And 9 years after his death, it named him anyway. Somewhere out there tonight, there are other men who believe, as Harry Greenwell believed, that time and death have buried what they did. They are wrong. The evidence is patient. The databases keep growing. And every year, the family trees fill in a little more. Vicky Heath, Peggy Gill, and Jeannie Gilbert went to work one night and never came home. It took more than 3 decades, an FBI team, and a genealogist tracing branches of a stranger's family. But the man who took them is no longer a ghost on a highway. He has a name now, and everyone knows it belongs to a murderer, not the beloved neighbor he pretended to be. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these women deserve to be remembered, subscribe. The next one is coming.